Good afternoon, good Tuesday afternoon, every one of you guys, and everyone who is on Zoom, and everyone who is joining us on Facebook. Again, I don't know whether you've heard us for the first time or this is your first time. I've got not too much time to introduce Dr. Kiran Krishnan, but I would love to. Because guys, if you want to see the genius, okay, listen to the genius today. He's a genius. He's a bugs genius. And he wants to be called a super nerd because he is. Because for what he knows, you gotta be a super nerd. The kindness of Kiran strikes me. He is a chief science officer with Microbiome labs. And so he's a creator of amazing products. He's a research, well published. And if you want to look him up, I will encourage you absolutely go to a National Institute of Health database, aka known as pubmed.gov. I mean, you're more than welcome to Google him if you want to do Google Academy. I usually go more scientifically based oriented. So it is our chance today to talk about microbiome, to continue the conversation, microbiome, microgut, probiotics, and everything. So Kiran, without further ado, I'm so grateful. Thank you. Last lecture was absolutely outstanding. So I think I've sent you some sort of probes and agenda, and whatever you want to cover, I think that to me, sort of the connection of probiotics, microbiome, and brain. Microbiome, obviously, this day and age, an immune system. Everybody now talks about vagus nerve and the connection. There is a new term, so I'm sure you know about this. I just discovered, but I'm sure there's a connection, which is called glymphatics. And it seems like, oh, you're nodding your head. So, and I'm sure there's a connection between glymphatics and microbiome and microgut. So, and more, you go, and I will just shut up.
No, I think there's a lot of different things to cover here. I do love the general concept of talking about the gut-brain connection. The gut-brain connection is a really kind of, in parts, a mysterious connection. There's a lot of evolutionary root in our gut-brain connection. There's a lot of significance in how we function with regards to the gut-brain connection. And in fact, the gut is really, in many circles, considered the second brain. I would almost say it's the other brain, because second meaning it's somehow, from a status standpoint, lower than the primary brain. And you really can't say that when you understand what the gut and the brain do for each other and with each other. They really function in tandem in many ways. We've also offloaded so many things that the brain needs. We've offloaded it to the gut. There's a lot of things that the brain needs that we cannot get from our diet, that we cannot make ourselves, that we count on our microbes and the microbiome to produce for us. And for that, there's a very specific reason why evolution has directly connected the gut to the brain. The gut and the brain are directly and intimately connected through a number of ways. One is through a very intricate neurological system. So that's the enteric nervous system, which is the second most dense level of nerve endings in the body, next to the spinal cord. And that enteric nervous system is connected directly to the brain through the vagus nerve. And then beyond that, there is through the lymphatic system, there is through the circulatory system, all of these other ways that components of the gut can influence the brain. Every single day, including our circadian rhythm, is dictated in part by functions in the gut. Immune response in the brain is controlled by the gut. Every single neurotransmitter that we know our body makes is also made in the gut. And our brain would cease to develop or function or protect itself in the ways that we know it does without the function of the gut. So, and then here's the most important part. A dysfunctional gut becomes the most toxic thing to the brain. So as good of a friends as the gut and the brain are, and they function well together, they're critical to work together in order to perpetuate our health and wellness. When the gut becomes dysfunctional, it becomes the most offensive thing to the brain long term.
Why?
You know why?
Why?
So a dysfunctional gut not only harms the brain in the sense that it produces toxins that actually directly go and impact the brain. The main one being LPS, so lipopolysaccharides that are made in the lumen of the gut from gram-negative bacteria. And again, a large majority of the microbes that live in your gut commensally make LPS. It's a normal part of what the microbes do. But when your gut is leaky and dysfunctional, then that LPS is allowed to leak through into circulation. LPS that goes from the gut into the brain has been found to have a long-term prolonged effect on the brain, including the onset of early stages of Alzheimer's, of Parkinson's, of dementia, of leptin resistance, of brain fog, so things like memory loss, recollection issues, inflammation in the amygdala, the hippocampus, all of these intricate areas of the brain, all that
Hang on. Guys, amygdala, this is your sensitive brain.
Mm-hmm.
This is your emotions. This is basically your love center.
Yep.
And what Dr. Krishnan is talking to you, per se, just write it down, do some research. Lipopolysaccharide. Look into this. We don't have enough time to get into details, but thank you for bringing it up. Incredibly important.
Yeah, so if you look up things like LPS, which is what lipopolysaccharide is abbreviated, and you look at amygdala inflammation, you'll see how there's all this great evidence that LPS from the gut in a leaky gut is allowed to translocate past the gut lining into the circulation, make its way into the brain. And when it causes inflammation in an area like the amygdala, it disrupts emotional response in a very dramatic way. So it can completely alter your brain chemistry over time, especially. And then the leptin resistance issues, and then the serotonin and dopamine dysfunctions, because one of the things that inflammation in the brain will lead to, or what LPS in itself can do, is actually inhibit dopamine binding by dopamine receptors in the brain. And dopamine is a really important hormone to provide stimulation to the reward centers of the brain. Right? So without adequate dopamine binding, people end up with addictive behaviors because you're doing things to stoke dopamine response. You might find that food does that to some degree, then you become addicted to food. That becomes a metabolic issue down the road. You might become addicted to substances. It may be just addicted to porn. It may be sex addiction. So many different things. All of those addictions are dopamine dysfunction. And the gut plays such a massive role in dopamine dysregulation, especially the lipopolysaccharides. And then, like I mentioned, Alzheimer's, right? So we know that Alzheimer's is an incredibly scary condition. Alzheimer's is one of two of the largest neurodegenerative conditions next to Parkinson's. And Alzheimer's is a very progressive condition. And in fact, the prevalence rate of Alzheimer's in the modern society is increasing quite dramatically. And we're seeing early onset Alzheimer's in younger and younger people. So what is going on with Alzheimer's? Well, about a decade ago, they recognized that in Alzheimer's, there was a conformational change that was observed in the brain through these formation of beta amyloid plaques, right? So then the question is, what is causing that beta amyloid plaquing? Is it a genetic issue? Is there some gene that gets turned on at some point, right, that causes that? That's a small fraction, as Svetlana is indicating. The biggest thing is it's an inflammatory response that goes on in the brain. There's an actual attack happening, an activation of the immune response in the brain that eats away at the neuro tissue and causes neurodegeneration. Now, what is triggering that inflammatory response? Study in 2017 in September showed that in the Alzheimer's brain, they were able to enrich in the perinuclear region LPS from the gut. So LPS from the gut, which is a very inflammatory, toxic compound, actually makes its way through the gut lining into circulation and into the brain and accumulates in certain regions of the brain where it triggers an inflammatory immune response. That inflammatory immune response starts eating away at brain tissue. eventually developing the plaquing, which is consistent with the physiological observation of the Alzheimer's brain. So
Well,
basically, what's going on?
and there is exactly per se probably the same connection with alpha-synuclein and parking in Parkinson's disease, creating that condition.
Yep,
So
absolutely.
from me to the cells, it's your accumulation of LPS through multiple factors, through the leaky gut and then microgut deficiency, leading to the accumulation of this, creating, to me per se, this, I call it cellular garbage, cellular stress, cellular dirtiness, which is an oxidative stress, which is going to lead to disruption of the cellular cleansing apparatus and stuff. For example, very simple, we can line it up with per se glutathione, not glutathione deficiency, as to massive glutathione depletion, because the cell cleans it, but the cell cannot produce anymore because the cell is exhausted. And then as the pro-inflammatory defense mechanism, there's a formation of alpha amyloid plaque.
Yep. And the alpha-synuclein is really important as well, because there was a recent study that was published, I think it was in 2019. This was an animal model study because it's hard to study these things in humans, but they were able to show, say that again?
Oh, you think?
Yeah, trust me, if somebody does clinical trials, it's really hard to get certain trials through. But what they were able to show was that bacillus, for example, in the gut, actually has a post-translational capability of tuning down the expression of alpha-synuclein. So there is an effect from the gut that actually directly targets this metabolite, if you will, that has a huge impact on the degeneration of neuronal tissues. Now, the same kind of pathogenesis occurs in Parkinson's. The very first symptom of Parkinson's is constipation, chronic constipation. Parkinson's starts in the gut. And then eventually you get what we call microglial activation. Those are immune cells in the neuronal tissues. And that microglial activation comes from the presence of LPS in the central nervous system.
Here comes your glymphatics. Here we're going into glymphatics.
Exactly, and so the circulation and the drainage within the neurological tissue is something that's a completely new concept. It was only, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 6 years ago that they figured out that the brain has its own lymphatic system. Think about all of the times that they have dissected the human brain and observed it and annotated it and marked it and so on. All of these years, starting in the early 16th, 17th century, we finally figured out very recently that the brain has its own lymphatic system. And there is, brain-specific or neurological specific immune cells. There are macrophages, which are termed macrophages in the rest of the body, but in the brain, it's called microglia cells, right? So these cells are immune cells that are specific to brain protection. And the activation of microglial cells is in part directed from the gut microbiome. And the microglial cells can get overactivated and create too much inflammation if there are things like LPS from the gut in the neurological tissue, and it'll damage the tissue over time. And when you start losing the tissue, then you start getting that progressive neurodegeneration, right? And there are some genetic factors that'll make that even faster. Right? There's something called a PINK1 deficiency in Parkinson's, for example, that drives accelerated neurodegeneration. But ultimately, even if you have a high degree of genetic susceptibility, you can slow down or maybe even never trigger those processes if your gut and your nutrition and all of that is sound, right? So that's a really important connection.
This is terrific. But now let me ask you a question about microgut. So, because obviously, per se, we're not talking about microbiome of the brain, in the brain, the intimate microbiome of the brain, because I think that's another discussion.
Right.
However, we're talking, let's say, about microbiome in the gut. So it's not the bacteria, goes through the vagus nerve into the gut and blah, blah, into the brain.
Right.
So we're talking about the microbiota that produces something.
Exactly.
which
Yeah.
is delivered via, per se, by via vagus or some other mechanism into the brain or into the spinal cord, into the peripheral nervous system, or into the central nervous system. How does that work? So because you mentioned serotonin, you mentioned dopamine,
Yeah.
that is produced by the bugs.
Yeah, largely. Yeah. Something around 90% of all the serotonin.
Any specific
No, so with the serotonin production, for example, they have identified that spore-forming bacteria are the most important stimuli for the production of serotonin. So serotonin is produced in a type of cell called the enterochromaffin cell in the gut.
enterochromaffin cell, yeah.
Yeah, and these cells, these EC cells, are specifically stimulated by certain classes of bacteria, and without those bacteria, they won't get stimulated. And so we've outsourced that pushing of the button and that turning on to the microbes in the system. We know that Mycobacterium embacae, which is a microbe that comes in from the soil, for example, if you garden and you work in the dirt, you'll get exposure to the soil microbe, and this microbe can dramatically stimulate the production of serotonin. The same thing with dopamine. There's a number of microbes within the system that stimulate dopamine production. And dopamine, again, is largely produced in the gut. And as I mentioned before, every neurotransmitter that we know about that is produced by our endocrine system, that means our hormonal organ system, right? Every single neurotransmitter is also produced in the gut. And so the gut is really a secondary endocrine system. And in fact, there's evidence that the gut endocrine system is the originator of most of these neurotransmitters and hormones. There's evidence that our own organ systems learned how to produce hormones and neurotransmitters from the gut microbiome, right? The synthesis of hormones, because hormones and neurotransmitters are cellular communication devices that bacteria have been using for billions of years, right? It's not unique to us, right? And the bacteria don't produce serotonin just for us. They secrete and produce serotonin because that's part of their language. And they've been doing that for millennia, right? And we have to remember that within each of our cells is an ancient pleiotropic bacteria. All of our cells contain mitochondria. Mitochondria are actually ancient bacteria. There's a reason why mitochondria has its own DNA, right? We've got our chromosomal DNA, which dictates all of this features that we have, the color of our eyes, our height, our skin, our hair, all of that stuff. And then we have mitochondrial DNA, which is completely separate and highly conserved. That mitochondrial DNA is ancient bacterial DNA that has been preserved for millions of years because it plays a really important role in the communication between the microbes that live in and on us and then each one of our cells. Our cells being a construct of an ancient microbe itself, right? So all of these neurotransmitters are produced in the gut. So we started talking about how the gut can become toxic to the brain, right? Through LPS, through bacterial flagellin, through toxins. There are specific bacteria that will actually produce toxins like, for example, Campylobacter. One of the things it does is it produces a toxin that acts on the neurological system that creates panic and anxiety, right? So there's a number of those kind of bacteria that can induce panic, that can induce anxiety. It can turn on the sympathetic system. It can turn on your flight or fight response. And it's doing it for a couple of different reasons. One, because one of the things that happens when you're panicked or you're nervous is your bowels become loose, right? People actually have runny diarrhea or loose bowels when you become nervous. We feel it in the pit of our stomach. That helps these pathogenic bacteria with their competition at the real estate level in the gut. Because when you have diarrhea and you release a lot of microbes through that diarrhea, through the flushing of the top layer of your mucosa, then it opens up more real estate for these pathogens. That's part of the reason why they create neurotransmitters and toxins that either create loose stool and dysfunction in the gut, or create the anxiety response in the host. Now, the other reason for that is because when we are panicked and when our sympathetic system is activated, our stress hormone levels go up, right? So cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine, all of that increases. One of the results of that is your immune system gets suppressed. When you are heightened, when you're in stress, when you're in flight or fight, your immune system is suppressed. And when your immune system is suppressed, it gives these opportunistic microbes more of a chance to proliferate. So this is the kind of system they want to create in you. They want to create a nervous, anxious, poor bowel functioning, stressed person, right? That is their ideal host. And think about how many people fit that bill just walking around every single day, right? And a lot of it is driven through dysbiotic gut microbes in your microbiome. So a lot of what we deal with in terms of anxiety, stress, clinical depression, and all that can be significantly helped by fixing what's going on in the gut, because that becomes the predominant source of it.
But the thing is, again, the listeners and the friends need to understand that you cannot just fix the gut with probiotics, with spore biotics, with this kind of stuff. You need to fix the gut. Because again, you already mentioned, let's say, mitochondria, and per se the significance of colonic lining mitochondria, enterocyte, colonic cells are called enterocytes or colonocytes mitochondria. As well as now you probably open my brain in terms of connection of microbiota and every single mitochondria in the body. Because I honestly think, to me, mitochondria is the core ingredient, is a core organelle in the cell. To me, mitochondria is the motherboard of the cell.
Yeah. So, I mean, absolutely. Without the mitochondria, the cell would cease to function, right?
Absolutely.
And aging is defined as mitochondrial dysfunction. So there was a study that was published almost over a decade ago where they took tissue samples from a 5-year-old and tissue samples from a 90-year-old, and they send it to pathologists. And these are experts at examining cells. And they said, can you define what the differences are between these tissues? They didn't say which one was which. The only thing that they could tell the difference between a 5-year-old's tissue samples and a 90-year-old's tissue samples was the number of functioning mitochondria in the cells, right? That's the only difference.
Because I am a pathologist, and I actually did the study, a little bit off topic. I did a study on tumorous mitochondria.
Mm-hmm.
I did electron microscopy on breast cancer tumorous mitochondria. So I saw, what does it mean dysfunctional, morphologically abnormal mitochondria that doesn't look like mitochondria at all.
Totally. Yeah.
Looks like
absolutely. Well, and then here's the thing. Right.
In light microscopy, I won't be able to see that. I need, per se, upon electron microscopy, absolutely. And that's what we teach, that with aging, not only you lose the number of mitochondria, but you also lose the functionality of mitochondria. Again, can you bring it back? Absolutely, you can. And per se, you, Dr. Krishnan, is the absolutely a perfect example of it, because what you did, and hopefully you do, you are pursuing intermittent fasting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And not only that, and you're pursuing some exercise.
Yeah.
So welcome to mitochondrial biogenesis.
Exactly, yeah. And here's a critical thing. There's something called a microbiome mitochondria axis, right? There's direct language between your gut microbiome and all of your mitochondria in your cells. There's a number of different things. So number one, just from a basic metabolic side, there are receptors called G protein coupled receptors that are found on the lining of your gut and on your fat cells. One of the functions of those receptors is they bind short chain fatty acids that are produced by your microbiome, like butyrate, and then they trigger something called AMP. And AMP triggers your mitochondria to start burning fuel through beta oxidation, which is the fat metabolism. And that has a systemic effect. So after you eat a meal, if you're eating the right kind of meal and you have the right kind of microbes, one of the effects of eating the meal is the microbes produce these short chain fatty acids and turn on systemic fat burning into your system. So we not only, of course, improve metabolic response, but we reduce the amount of free fatty acids that are floating around in the body, which is hugely important because these free fatty acids eventually become toxic compounds in circulation. Another aspect of the microbiome mitochondria axis is the production of something called urolithins. Urolithins are these really amazing compounds. One of the most well-studied is called urolithin A. Urolithins is a compound that can only be derived from the microbiome. You don't find it in foods. We can't make it ourselves. It's a byproduct of the microbiome metabolizing polyphenols that are coming in colored fruits and vegetables and so on. When they metabolize some certain polyphenols, they'll produce urolithins. What do urolithins do for the mitochondria? Well, they do a couple of things. One is they improve something called mitogenesis, right? Which is what you just mentioned, is the regeneration of new mitochondria within the cell itself. And then they also stimulate something called mitophagy. Because as the machinery within the mitochondria get dysfunctional, your body is supposed to get rid of those mitochondria because they are causing toxic response in the cell. So that balance between increasing mitophagy and generating mitochondrial genesis cleans up the cellular machinery and regenerates that cell so it's a younger, more functioning cell. And that's the signal that comes from the gut.
It's an incredible concept.
Right?
So
it's amazing.
Eat your polyphenols.
Mm-hmm.
So eat your foods, let's say drink your green teas.
Yep.
Eat your berries.
Your berries, yep. You know, you can have some dark chocolate, a little bit of wine. There's some polyphenols in those things too, right? But here's the thing. So that's the kind of conceptual change we have to have in our mind, where we're no longer feeding us. We're feeding all of us, right? We're feeding the microbes too. So there may be foods you don't like that are really rich in polyphenols, and you go, I don't like that because I don't like those foods. Well, your microbiome needs it because your cells need it, right? Your mitochondria, the most important component of every one of your cells, the only cells in your body that don't have mitochondria are your red blood cells. That's because their sole job is to carry oxygen, so they don't have the structure for it. But every other cell, including every one of your brain cells, is loaded with mitochondria. And when you age, the definition of aging is the diminishing functionality of mitochondria. It's called a mitochondrial free radical theory of aging. And there's so much evidence behind it, right? So if you want to slow down the aging process, you want to slow down the disease process, you want to improve recovery when you do have dysfunction, you have to pay attention to your mitochondria. You have to feed your mitochondria, and the biggest way of feeding the mitochondria is through the microbiome. That's such an important thing.
Because I was so itching to ask you about mitochondria and microbiome. And however, we started with LPS, microbiome, dysfunctional gut, dysfunctional microgut, LPS, into the brain. That's how we connected. And we were talking Parkinson's disease. Well, Parkinson's disease is an ability to make something, and it happens in the organ on the brain, in the part of the brain that is called substantia nigra. So now we were chatting about mitochondrial biogenesis and decline of the number of mitochondria with aging. As Dr. Krishnan mentioned, absolutely correct, that the only cells in the body that doesn't, I don't even know whether we can call red blood cells as a true cell,
right?
But that's the only cell that doesn't contain mitochondria. However, the cells, the neurons in substantia nigra, which is responsible for Parkinson's disease, contains the highest number of mitochondria, which is described to over 2 million mitochondria per cell. That's over 2 million. So now you probably should anticipate the importance of healthy gut, good foods, everything polyphenol, thanks God, dark chocolate, microgut, and your brain.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah, and when you think about it, so when your gut is dysfunctional, it's a double whammy to the brain, because
Double whammy.
not only is now a dysfunctional gut being a toxic source of dysfunction of the brain, but also the most basic supportive components that we count on the gut are no longer functioning, right? So not only is your brain getting toxicity from the gut, it's also not getting all of the supportive nutrients that it needs from the gut. And so it's a double whammy, and that's why it can progress so fast. You know, and it's a very scary condition. And, you know, ultimately you can have things like other neurological issues, like, for example, LPS can leak into the neurological system, and it can actually activate nociceptors, which can turn on pain signaling in the body, right? So all the people with fibromyalgia and all this chronic pain, that can come from a toxic gut. And then, of course, when your gut is healthy, what it's supposed to be doing is producing things like GABA. GABA is one of the most important compounds of calming you down, bringing down the sympathetic system, activating the parasympathetic, right? GABA is absolutely critical to mood balancing. And in fact, lots of the synthetic drugs that are used for mood balancing are trying to stimulate GABA. That's part of what they do. But you have all of these microbes in your gut that do it for you naturally. They're also producing things like brain-derived neurotrophic factor. BDNF is a really important compound produced during sleep that actually helps repair the brain, which is a really important aspect of it, because, of course, every cell in the body is undergoing damage every single day. Part of the damage is from just the mitochondrial activity alone. When the mitochondria during cellular respiration is producing ATP, it's releasing things like superoxides and all of that, right? So there's a byproduct to our cellular metabolic process that needs to be quenched and needs to be fixed. And so if we don't have the repair mechanism, that's where the glutathione, the catalase, and all comes in so important, because they repair the natural damage that comes from the metabolic process. Same thing with things like BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, so important in that repair mechanism. And your microbiome produces the vast majority of it, right? So again, if your microbiome is dysfunctional, it's a double whammy to the brain. And not only does it provide long-term issues like risks for things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so on, it also creates short-term dysfunctions like brain fog and cognitive dysfunction and memory recall issues, mood issues, anxiety, depression. All of that stuff is driven by a dysfunctional gut. You know, so we cannot overstate the importance of a healthy gut in terms of a healthy brain.
It's exactly, the connection is incredible. But again and again and again, your healthy microgut will never become healthy without your healthy gut. And, you know, it's like, it almost seems to me that every one of us inadvertently has leaky gut.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, you know, because there are some really delicate balances that go on in the microbiome in order to maintain a healthy barrier system in the gut. And those things get thrown off very easily, right? Diet changes, lifestyle, you know, sedentary life, exposure to all of these toxic things, you know, just drinking the water in most places will create dysbiosis in the gut, because the water is loaded with chlorine and fluoride and is missing any of these beneficial minerals that our microbiome needs. Just eating food in most places, as the food is loaded with pesticides and herbicides and all that act as very strong antimicrobials. All of these things continuously damage the ecosystem in the gut, and that continual damage needs continual attention and repair. You know, it's almost like you have a garden in your backyard and you have a toxic power plant spewing in toxins into your garden every single day, right? Unless you are actively tending that garden every single day, it's going to go awry very quickly, right? So that's just the nature of the world we live in today. So, you know, we really have to pay attention to cultivating our gut microbiome every single day.
This is incredible. Let me ask you another question, which is microgut and estrogens or sex hormones.
Yeah.
Because apparently there is a very direct, tight link.
There is, yeah. The estrogen connection is really interesting. The most well-studied component of that is a constellation of bacteria called estrobolome. And estrobolome plays a couple of different roles within estrogen metabolism and functioning within the body. One of the main roles that it plays, which is an important role, is the breakdown of estrogen and the metabolism of estrogen so it doesn't get reabsorbed, right? So estrogen becomes conjugated and then secreted into the gut in an inactive form. And then what it's supposed to happen is you're supposed to metabolize it, or your microbiome is supposed to break it down and metabolize it. And then it doesn't get reabsorbed into the system, so that there's tight estrogen control in the system. If not, it could get deconjugated and then end up getting absorbed back into the gut, which means that it can lead to estrogen dominance issues. And there's lots of estrogen dominance issues that women face each single day. And so that recycling or that removal of estrogen is a very important part of the gut microbiome. And, you know, part of it, there's some data that shows that estrogen, the metabolic byproducts of estrogen degradation in the gut actually can end up in the mucosa in the gut and then travel to areas like the mucosal or the vaginal canal, where it can feed the beneficial bacteria in the vaginal canal. You know, so there's this nice cross feeding that goes on between the gut and the vaginal bacteria. So that's a really important component of it. Now, there's also new evidence that testosterone is also produced in the microbiome. And testosterone, what's interesting is the juxtaposition of it. So there's a part of the gut, I can't remember what the exact physiological area is called, but there's a part of the gut that is very close to the thin tissue layer by the prostate, right? That separates, yeah.
The rectum.
Yeah, exactly. And so that there is production of testosterone in that region of the gut. And the thinking may be that it may be at the barrier there might be thin enough where testosterone might actually migrate through and into our circulation from there, right? So that may be a thing, but it's at very early stages. Now, what I do know about testosterone impact for sure with the microbiome is there's something called the gelding theory, where it shows that chronic elevation of LPS in circulation through leaky gut actually starts shutting down testosterone production. It works counteractively. So the inflammatory activation of the immune response by LPS, that's that same compound we talked about from the gut, migrating into the circulation. If you have chronic elevated LPS and chronic activation of the inflammatory immune response, then your testosterone production starts shutting down.
I will not dispute it. Yeah, I will not dispute it through the hypothalamic pituitary axis.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and so, I mean, if you think about it evolutionarily, we don't, as men, you know, when our body thinks we're sick, which is what's happening when you have LPS in your system floating around. It's a bacterial toxin. So to your body, you are now ill with a bacterial toxin floating around your system. The last thing it's going to do is produce testosterone, because testosterone is needed for muscle development and, you know, the virility that men tend to have for sexual reproduction and so on. We don't need to be doing all of those things when we're sick, right? So they're counteracting systems. And so one of the issues that we see now with this whole concept of low T, where you're seeing lower and lower levels of testosterone in younger and younger men. I work with a couple of docs, one in Salt Lake and one in Chicago, that specializes in sex dysfunctions, both men and women. They have guys in their early 30s that have testosterone levels of people in their 50s and 60s.
That's
you know,
right.
it's absolutely mind-boggling when you think about it. And so this chronic inflammation from the gut is one of the big culprits of bringing down testosterone levels, or a condition called hypogonadism. So impact on estrogen, impact on testosterone is real with the gut, right?
Let me ask you a question about xenoestrogens.
Mm-hmm.
Any chance of, let's say, microbiome, microgut helping and deconstructing xenoestrogens, or on contrary, xenoestrogens are harming microbiome?
Yeah, so there is some evidence that the gut microbiome can metabolize both xeno and phytoestrogens, both of them, that can be actually quite dysfunctional. And in fact, one of the things that the microbiome does is actually convert the estrogen from a potentially harmful form to a beneficial form of estrogen, right? That whole conversation, the conversion between estradiol and estriol, those conversions, one that can be
from estron, which is the
Mhm.
harmful, into estriol,
Yep.
which is good,
Which is
and
it.
estradiol, which is also good.
Yeah, and that conversion is done by the microbiome. And estriol, we know, is protective against things like breast cancer and other
Okay.
conditions, right?
Uh-huh.
So part of what happens with the estrogen that enters into the gut is some of it gets converted into these beneficial forms. So then you have this
It's not going
protective
to do
effect.
it's not going to do the same with the xenoestrogens.
It's not going to convert it that I've seen. I haven't seen data on the conversion, but I've seen data on metabolism of xenoestrogens within the
So
microbiome.
awesome. So let it metabolize it. Now,
Totally.
you mentioned phytoestrogens,
Yeah.
which are actually pretty darn good, because if we're talking about, for example, flax seeds, which are, our essential fatty acids and more.
Well, and then there's some phytoestrogens that act like prebiotics for bacteria,
Right.
like isoflavones, right? Isoflavones are phytoestrogens from things like soy and so on that actually feed bacteria and act as prebiotics, so they can be beneficial. And so the microbiome metabolizes those readily, and it does it in a beneficial way.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
You're seriously overwhelming me. I have a brain of a zebrafish. I have an attention span of a zebrafish. 40 seconds. And I made I don't know how many pages of notes. Now let's go into, for example, hot topic.
Yeah.
Microbiome, microgut, and antiviral effect of something. How does that work?
Oh yeah, so I actually just did a lecture on that today. So here's a really important part of it, right? So for when a virus infects your system, there are several stages to that part of the infection and several stages to the immune response. Consequently, the first stage is when a virus infects, the cell itself that it's infecting has some defense mechanisms that it tries to elicit, right? It releases type 1 interferon to try to interfere with the viral replication machinery, but then it also releases inflammatory cytokines to try to signal to the immune system and the rest of the community that, hey, something's going on here. Now, what's really interesting about that is that one of the biggest signals for when a virus starts infecting a cell comes from the microbiota around that cell. So the microbiota talks to the rest of the immune system and says, hey, there's something going on here that you need to really understand. Let me give you a couple examples of that. So during a flu infection, right, when you breathe in influenza virus and it starts infecting the upper respiratory cells, one of the things that the upper respiratory cells will do is actually release type 1 interferon to try to block the replication of the virus. Now, next to that, all of the microbes next to that infected cell will start stimulating the release of something called inflammasomes. And inflammasomes are the critical part of fighting off the influenza virus, because what it does is it immediately recruits innate immune cells to that region. It recruits natural killer cells, cytotoxic T cells that show up there and start killing off the infected cells and killing the virus itself. Now, the next thing the microbiome does is it recruits dendritic cells to that area. Dendritic cells then come in, it eats either parts of the infected cells or it eats the virus itself. And then dendritic cells go to the local lymph nodes where it presents those parts of the virus to the T cells and B cells that then mount the adaptive immune response. All of those processes are dependent on the local microbiota and the gut microbiota. So here's how it happens. This is what's so fascinating about it. When influenza infects your lungs, let's say, comes in and infects your lung microbiota sees that infection, sends a signal to your gut microbiota that informs your gut microbiota that there's an infection in the lung. The gut microbiota then releases things like interleukin-6, TNF-alpha, and other kinds of recruitment cytokines to try to get the innate immune cells to the lungs, and then eventually get the dendritic cells to the lungs as well. And then will start releasing anti-inflammatory compounds to slow down the inflammation part of the response and move it to the adaptive part of the response. So in fact, studies have been shown that if you stop the communication between the microbiome and the immune system cannot mount a response, right? So on no biotic mice studies, these are mice that are raised with no microbiome, right? They have all of their immune cells, meaning they have a bone marrow, they have a thymus, everything is producing immune cells. So they have dendritic cells, macrophages, T cells, B cells, everything, right? They have all the components of the immune system, and then they inject a pathogen like influenza virus, and all the immune cells stand around and look at it. They cannot respond. They have no direction. The moment they put a microbiome back into the mouse, all of those immune cells go to work and start doing what they do. So almost all of the orchestration of immune response comes from the microbiome, right? Including providing energy to the immune cells, right? Butyrate is one of the main fuel sources of macrophages and dendritic cells that are circulating around and surveying and protecting the body. They need it for differentiation and for energy metabolism, right? So, and the cytotoxic T cells and the natural killer cells, they use things like the complement system, they use reactive oxygen species, all of those things, all of those come from the microbiome, right? And so it's so critically important. Another example that we could use, look at rotavirus infection that happens in the gut, right? It's going to infect the intestinal epithelium. So the actual lining of the cell, of the intestines, those are the cells that this virus infects, right? So the moment a rotavirus infects one of your intestinal epithelial cells, the microbes around it, including Bifidobacteria, Lactobacillus, a number of the commensal bacteria around it, detect that this cell is infected, and it'll release interleukin 22, which then stimulates the cell to repair itself, get rid of itself, and then a new cell to pop up. Because not only do we not want this cell infected because it's going to cause the multiplication of viruses and bacteria, viruses in particular, but when this cell is infected, it completely screws up the absorption of nutrients, right? Because this intestinal cells, all these cells lined up, are highly important for transcellular and paracellular absorption of nutrients, right? So now, when the gut barrier is damaged, it creates a much more problem for the body, because not only is it causing an infection, but it's also compromising metabolism, compromising the assimilation, absorption of nutrients, and so on. So the microbes around that know it. So one of the first things they do is they stimulate the changing over of this infected cell, and they stimulate apoptosis in this cell, right? Apoptosis is programmed cell death. Imagine that. Imagine the intimate connection here, right? A microbe, which is a whole other species of organism. It's a different kingdom. We are a mammal. This is a microbe. That microbe can send a signal to our cell to kill itself because it's infected. Well, it's mind-boggling.
Mind-boggling. It's the balance, the synergy. I mean, that orchestra of, it's mind-boggling how every aspect of, you know, of our living is important.
Absolutely. And here's the crazy thing about it, right? If we don't have the right microbes in place, right? And one of the terms I use is the microbiome is the neighborhood watch for our immune system. It's impossible for the immune system to survey all of the inside of our body, right? To put this in perspective, the inside part of our body is covered with a mucosal layer, right? Every orifice that something can enter into, whether it's your mouth, your nose, your eyes, your ears, your skin, your urogenital tract, every orifice into the body puts things into a mucosal layer. That mucosal layer is almost 4,000 square feet in surface area. It's a massive amount of square footage inside the body, and every millimeter of that surface area is covered in microbes, right? Over 40 trillion microbes. So imagine that you are an immune cell and your job is to survey and protect the body. You're looking for what? You're looking for bacteria, viruses, fungus, and so on that could potentially harm the body. right? And you're trying to survey almost 4,000 square feet of space, and every single square millimeter of that space is already covered by bacteria, viruses, and fungi, right? How are you ever going to survey that system, right? It's a 200,000 to 1 ratio. For every one immune cell whose job it is to police your body, you've got 200,000 microbial cells already living there. So it's an impossible task. The only way your immune system can do it and function and protect you is because the microbiome is the neighborhood watch. It's the eyes and the ears for the immune system. When the microbiome sees something coming into the area that is disruptive, that doesn't look like the normal ecosystem, the microbiome sends signals to the immune system to come to that area and deal with it. And then the microbiome provides the immune system with the tools it needs to deal with it, and then trains the immune system to learn this pathogen, so that the next time it sees it, it can react to it much faster, right? Now, if you don't have a functional microbiome, if you've got a lot of pathogens or opportunistic pathogens in your system, whether it's viral pathogens like cytomegalovirus or Epstein-Barr virus or herpes simplex virus, all of these kinds of viruses, or opportunistic bacteria in your system, right? Like Pseudomonas and Klebsiella and so on, they are not on your side. They are more on the side of the incoming pathogens. They are not going to alert your immune system to the presence of the pathogens, because what they are is opportunistic. They exist in chaos, right? And they thrive in chaos. So if those are the predominant microbes in your system, then when something new comes in, like a COVID or influenza or something, it starts to create disruption in that area. These opportunistic microbes do not have an incentive to fix that disruption. They actually thrive better in that disruptive state, because now the immune system is going to be distracted. That gives them a chance to proliferate, right? So right there, if you're dysbiotic, you have an overgrowth of opportunistic bacteria, viruses, and all that, already your immune system is compromised in terms of its ability to respond to the presence of something. Right? And we cannot overstate the intimate connection between the microbiome and the immune system. They are essentially one. And here's one of my big messages throughout this time, because the immune system and nutritional support of the immune system has gotten a lot of attention. As important as things as vitamin D and vitamin C and zinc and all are, you cannot take enough of vitamin C or vitamin D to overcome a dysfunctional microbiome. Right? A dysfunctional microbiome is going to compromise your immune system. And it doesn't matter how much of those other micronutrients you take, it's not going to overcome it, because it's a root cause problem. So if you are focused on your immune system, you want to become resilient, you want your immune system to work the way it should, then you have to look at those micronutrients, but also pay really close attention to what's going on in your microbiome.
This is amazing. I'm going to steal your phrase. Microbiome is eyes and ears of immune system.
Yeah, the neighborhood watch. Our immune system cannot function or detect the presence of invading organisms without it.
You're thinking, who is the most vulnerable? The old, the obese, the metabolic syndrome, the diabetics.
Hypertensive, yeah.
What do they have?
Yep. So they all have dysfunctional microbiome.
They all have a dysfunctional gut and dysfunctional microgut.
And they all have chronic low-grade inflammation. So chronic low-grade inflammation is so disruptive to immune function, because remember, the signals that the microbiome provides in order to recruit your immune cells to the sites of action, whether it's the lungs, it's the upper respiratory tract, it's your skin, wherever the infection may be, the signals that the microbiome uses are inflammatory signals. Interleukin 6, TNF alpha, interferon gamma, all of these inflammatory signals. That's how your microbiome gets the attention of your immune system. If you have chronic low-grade inflammation, those signals are all over your body, right? And so when the microbiome does see an invading pathogen and sends out those signals, your immune system doesn't see it, because there's signals everywhere. Right? So it takes much longer for your immune system to get to the site of action and respond. That gives the virus a much bigger lead time in order to multiply and create a much bigger infection. Now, what happens then? Finally, the immune system does show up. Now the viral load is so much higher then the innate immune system goes crazy and hits everything with a massive blowtorch. Now you're going into the cytokine storm part of the infection, right? It's not an elegant response to it. Now it's a panic response. And now your immune system is hurting your system more than the virus itself, right? And again, that's all because of a delayed response. So every single person that is more susceptible to something like COVID is characterized by having a dysfunctional microbiome and chronic low-grade inflammation, right? Those two things are the absolute compromises to how the immune system functions.
Low grade, low grade.
Yeah, the low grade is a key because there's those same signals happening everywhere in the body. You know, the analogy I give is like, imagine you had a neighborhood of 500 homes, right? And every home has fire alarms in case the home catches on fire. Imagine if the neighborhood system was all off, where 300 out of those 500 homes constantly have fire alarms going off, right? And then the one time that a house actually catches on fire and the fire alarm goes off, the fire trucks would have no way to know which house to go to, right? The signal from the actual fire is being drowned out by all the other fire alarms. And that's what's happening in the body. All of this chronic low-grade inflammation that is the absolute phenotype of all of those conditions we talked about that make people most susceptible to COVID are characterized, are drowning out the signals from the microbiome trying to protect you from the infection.
Dr. Krishnan, this was incredible. And as of again, we only touched something.
Yeah.
You touched something. So sorry, I really have to ask you for the third one now.
Part 3, we just keep going.
I know, and we never touched upon testing.
Yes.
So, you know, it's like, Julia, stop laughing. So we're still doing the third one. So Kiran, it was so incredible. Let me stop Facebook and let me stop recording because I